My name's Étienne Quintal, and this is my colleague Dan Collen. I'll give him the possibility of introducing himself in a minute, but we work on the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center's online hate research and education project, which is more or less an 18-month-long foray into the realm of online hate. So we've worked in that field for quite some time in different capacities. Like we've done journalism. I was a researcher as well. I've done this work in academia as well, and we're also just activists who are trying to fight back against hate. I've personally been interested in kind of tracking and monitoring hate movements for quite some time, more or less since I was a teenager. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, like a lot of people, I got more and more interested in it, and I actually signed up for a master's program. They wrote a thesis looking at the propaganda made by white nationalist movements on platforms like TikTok, and that's kind of what got me started into this kind of more professionalized field of research.
And my background's in digital media, and I got into researching anti-Semitism and hate movements, specifically kind of as they intersect in digital media and online realms, specifically through journalism and blogging, actually. So that was kind of my synthesis.
Could you please tell us more about the online hate research and education project and the Hatepedia you are working on?
Yeah, sure. So more or less, like in broad lines, what we do is we study hateful memes that we found online. That's usually on most of the major social media platforms, because we consider memes especially to be kind of a form of the modern day political pamphlet. Insofar as people might not understand that they have a political function, and a lot of memes obviously don't have a political function, they're just there to be funny. But there's also a lot of memes that carry a lot of meaning, and especially political meaning, that can be analyzed into kind of like understanding what the stories that they're telling. So for what we do is essentially we try to draw out the stories and the symbols that are used in order to promote hate on and offline, right? Because there's a lot of cross-reference between both, and stuff that happens online often transpires into real life events. So over the course of the project, we've organized a lot of workshops with really a broad range of publics that range from everything from school teachers to students from the 4th grade to university to public service workers. And what we've tried to do is teach people about digital literacy, the importance of critical thought, the features of social media platforms, how they're exploited to promote hate, but also, in a very real way, how to like look beyond what you're seeing and look beyond the veil of humor that's often used in hateful communications online, in order to really understand the intention and the meaning and the objective of different forms of speech online. In terms of Hatepedia as well, so we've built a website off of a lot of our research, which contains quite a bit of stuff. The main feature on our website is our guide to online hate, which is more or less a list of key terms, concepts, symbols, and everything in between that we've kind of identified as major themes in our research. So from our data set, we've identified like images, we've identified slogans, that kind of stuff. And we decided to put it into a list that was approachable enough that people could be able to, kind of look it up and be able to see things that they've come up, concepts that they might not understand, so that the information's out there for anything from teachers who hear about hate movements in the classroom, to parents who are concerned about their kids watching habits online, to even to lawmakers and university professors and researchers who are hoping to like create new knowledge about this kind of realm of knowledge. Our website also contains stuff like a section on education, which we're working on. We're developing a bunch of programs in that regard, and I'll let my colleague Dan take it over for a little bit.
I think he covered it. Where Hatepedia initially, the website what we have now is sort of a guide to online hate, started as a kind of a secondary project that we saw as, well, we're gathering a lot of insights and we want to make something more accessible than an academic paper or long form reports, something that the average person can look at, search through and gain knowledge of if they're looking for something specific. So although
you are mainly addressing online hate, I guess it's partly spills over to gaming, video games and video game related platforms as well, such as Steam, Twitch or Discord and other forums and applications. So in your view, can video games play a role in addressing society's collective memory of certain events such as the Holocaust, but even more recent atrocities?
The answer is yes, and we do think they play a role. Movies and books detailing fiction are commonly understood already to be how many people are expected to learn about collective memory. A lot of people learn about the Holocaust through books and movies, even. The difference is that video games are a less accessible medium. They're less universal because they rely on very specific interactive one-on-one experiences. Everyone knows how to watch a movie. It is commonly understood how to learn how to read a book and the process of going through and reading a novel from start to finish. But when it comes to the work of fiction of video games, it's a lot more interpretive and it's a lot more customized by the game developer. So this means that commonly understood reading habits and capacities of how people absorb video game stories can be pretty broad. We have broad kind of societal understandings of how people read books and watch movies. Video games are more complicated. So the question of whether or not, for example, players skips cutscenes in a video game demonstrates this outright. The fact that some video games don't have any cutscenes and some video games are mostly cutscenes demonstrates this. The experience is much more specific to the individual art form than it is for just watching a movie. So that poses a challenge for absorbing collective memory. But I think as time goes on, and Étienne can weigh in as well, that video games will likely be adapted more to be kind of more understood as a way for people to absorb collective memory.
Yeah, my colleague Dan kind of made that point, but I'll jump off of it a little bit. In saying that, obviously, I think it's very clear that media in general can have a massive impact in how we view certain events. You think back to games like Call of Duty, or the Call of Duty Black Ops series, for example, which is set during the Cold Wars. And, I assume there's quite a few, high school students who've played that game quite a bit, who have not read a lot about the Cold War, but who mostly know about the Cold War because of this, right? So there's this function that it teaches people. In a lot of cases, it teaches people in a way that takes some shortcuts that, like all forms of media, video games need to be attractive. They need to be fun. They don't need to, make you think too much in a lot of cases. But I do think that creates a vacuum, or at least a gap where there's a possibility and really a gap to fill for people who want to make video games that are meant to convey accurate information. And there's games that are set in historical settings that do quite well. And I think that can have a lot of power in shaping how we understand different world events, and especially when it comes to, as you mentioned, atrocities and some of the worst things that have happened. I think there is a duty to use whatever medium that we can, especially a medium that's as interactive as video games, in order to make sure that people have a proper understanding of the basic facts of human history.
Thank you. So last year, the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center also launched its own video game engagement program. Could you please?
Our former director launched it by focusing specifically on depictions of concentration camps in video games. It featured a walkthrough of a concentration camp, a fictional one, in the video game Wolfenstein: The New Order. This was chosen because although Second World War games are kind of a dime a dozen, so to speak, depictions of the Holocaust in video games are exceptionally rare. So there are some very good reasons for this. It's an incredibly difficult theme to tackle, but as an anti-fascist video game, Wolfenstein at least tried to touch on the subject by depicting a fictional, mostly labor concentration camp in a dystopian fictional reality that takes place after the conclusion of the Second World War, and the Holocaust in a fictional reality where the Nazis won the war. So it's a dystopian version of the 1960s, I believe. I personally think that the video game achieved a difficult task by engaging with the theme of a slave labor camp without making the contact too traumatic for the player. I don't think that a perfect depiction of something of this nature could be done in a video game that's meant to be fun to play. I don't think something could be necessarily mass marketed as purely entertainment, especially not in a video game where it's a shooting game and the main purpose is to shoot and kill people in fast-paced action. I don't think it's achievable to properly deal with a perfect depiction of a concentration camp or the Holocaust in general, any theme that in a way that really resonates people both emotionally and teaches them historically in a game like that. The museum and our former director focused on the Holocaust, but one looking at fascism in video games would be really interesting. It's even more difficult to navigate the morality of how fascism, Nazism, and genocide are depicted in games like Fallout New Vegas, as the player can actually choose to become a fascist in these video games and play out a very well-crafted, a very deep story as a character performing unspeakable crimes. So as moviegoers, we have conversations about separating the actor from their character in the movies, when very good actors play very talented actors play characters that are very bad people well, and the atrocities that their characters commit. We have this conversation about being able to mentally separate the actor from their character. we don't have as many of these conversations yet grounded. We don't have the language for this as well, for people playing individual experiences in video games where they are themselves playing the villain, and when the villain is in fact a historic someone who's done committed unspeakable atrocities. We don't have the same language developed, and we don't have the same ethics either for allowing people to do the same. We don't have the same ethical kind of discussions. So as fascism continues to grow in the modern era, we may see the first generation where video games are a comparably large part of our lives, to with movies, comparable to movies, sorry, to reconcile with the idea of role-playing as fascists. And this can be really delicate. Anecdotally, as a gamer, I'd say certain depictions of fascism in video games can be educational and draw historical parallels. But indie video games are on the rise, and with them comes the potential for new markets with new moderation. So for example, when Super Columbine Massacre RPG came out years ago, which was a controversial free flash game where the player took the role of a school shooter in the United States Columbine Massacre, that only existed as a non-monetized flash game. So it's very hard to say what would happen if a game today were to push the exact right buttons, the exact same shock value that a game like that did today, and reach the market of video games. And another conversation about, well, would it be able to be monetized on that sort of scale? Would a game like that be able to reach that popularity today if it reached the same kind of trauma pushing buttons? I think that'd be really interesting to explore.
And I think my colleague's response was very thorough, but one thing that I can add to that is just, when we think back to a lot of the educational programs that we've developed or that we've run, this is one of the, the video game program is one of the ones that we're asked about the most often, quite kind of on par with some of the programming that we've done with more novel platforms like TikTok. I think partly because teachers specifically, but also parents are realizing that, there's a gap in knowledge, and there's a gap in awareness. And they're realizing that they haven't quite kept up with a lot of the new technologies and a lot of the new happenings. So I think programming like that, while it's not necessarily perfect, or it's not necessarily, we've talked about how Wolfenstein is a game that I think does a very good job of depicting the events, but obviously takes some liberties with it. And the program roots it in accurate information. I think that creates kind of an interest where people are really excited about new ways to convey meaning, to convey knowledge, while also being attractive to younger people who are really the ones who need to be tuning in and to be kept up to date with this stuff, right? So it definitely is one of the more in-demand programs that we've developed over time.
Thank you. I think we can agree on that we are kind of living in a post-truth populism ruled era, and it has become crucial for educators to use reliable, plausible, and perceptive evidentiary accounts of the past to help historical memories fractured by contested interpretations of the past set right. So, for example, many of the historical events has a contested interpretation by the far right. They also mamify events, or there is Holocaust denial and distortion. How do you think we can prevent these contested views to become the dominant ones?
Well, in the post-truth era, we and other educators are often trying to catch up to take what we call media literacy seriously, which is the capacity for someone to knowingly understand and navigate the media landscape. To be able to sort out disinformation or bad actors while they absorb media, basically. This helps, but I think we do need to take it a little bit step further in media literacy. We also need to tackle it in adults, but I think public education needs to not only tackle what disinformation looks like, but also address how disinformation works. Why is it prevalent? Part of this is teaching political and ideological motives for spreading disinformation. Another part is talking about the monetary motives for spreading disinformation and hate speech. Oftentimes it can be hard for people to understand why someone might spread content that they don't actually believe in themselves, or even just why they believe in that in general. So the fact that they are sharing it must mean they wholeheartedly endorse it personally. So this leads people to be skeptical of fact checks, and it leads people to be even skeptical of media literacy in general. Teaching the financial models of how social media and entertainment can profit from disinformation and hate speech and radicalization might help people understand this.
The question of how we can prevent contested interpretations or wrongful information from becoming dominant is really a challenging one, right? And if I had the answer, I think people would be I think the world would change radically if there was one person who had the answer to this, because we know that debates like this one, over contested interpretations, over misinformation and disinformation, they don't operate on an equal footing, right? Because when it comes to those debates, there's one side that's beholden to truth, one side that's dedicated to ensuring that truth and proper information are conveyed, and the other, frankly, isn't, right? I think what's really important, and my colleague mentioned quite a bit in terms of the digital literacy piece of this, but I think it's really important that people who, everyday people, teachers, even students, be aware that, be aware of the tactics that the other side, that people who are part of hate movements, for example, it's important to understand their tactics, to be able to contextualize their speech, and to really explain the function of some of the lies that they're telling, and kind of the effect that that's supposed to have. We see it quite a bit with regards to popular influencers who especially use humor as a means of covering up things that they're seriously arguing for. And I think it's important for students as young as possible to understand that speech, for example, that conveys information that's wrongful, even if it's doing it under the guise of humor, is still harmful. And that's not to say that we need to politicize humor, but that is to say that we need to understand that that humor can have a political function, and that the other side does have a vested interest in you not being aware of their tactics in order to convince you that their untruths are really the truth that we should be teaching in school, that kind of stuff. So while the question is very complex, I really do think that the solution is rooted in education.
Thank you. So we have a young generation now who actually grow up with social media, grow up with using internet, and they are surrounded by this post-truth, fake news and meme-filled environment. So other than good education, how do you think we can teach them to distinguish what's fake news, which meme actually acceptable, and as you said, which are the ones which are unacceptable, packaged into humor and sarcasm and irony? Do you think that actually your Hatepedia or some new, more educative, serious video game can help them with this?
We see gaming, I think, is not a monolith. So and community impacts culture, culture impacts community. And there are a lot of progressive anti-fascist and anti-racist communities for fans of video games, genres and specific games. There's also a lot of developers who affirm very healthy communities. Creating content and creating spaces that affirm diverse identities and actively counter the far right in gaming. And it's very important, specifically, we think to fighting online hate in video games. And likewise, that transfers to social media platforms that form around it. Platforms are just a medium where communities grow. The more affirming and the better stances that the community takes, the healthier that the environment of that social media environment is going to be. Moderation by governments or social media companies, of course, plays a role. But in order to have a successful social media company that thrives in a social media environment that persists, you need to have people that feel safe actually being there in that environment and feel like they are among their peers. So we think that's also a reflection of that. Tim, I think, can clarify much better.
Well, I don't know about much better, but one of the things that I really do like to emphasize, especially when I speak with teachers and sometimes with parents, is really the importance of almost like culturally appropriate solutions. Because one of the things that, where one of the areas where hate movements succeed is that they reach young people in cultural areas that young people hang out in, right? They speak to them in a language that they understand. They use cultural mediums that they understand and they use. And oftentimes, we talked about the peddling of lies and misinformation. In a lot of cases, the people who are fighting back against that are sometimes coming off as preachy. They're sometimes coming off as almost disconnected from the reality of young people, just because they're not speaking a similar language. They're not necessarily interacting with the same platforms, or they don't even have a basic understanding of, how video games operate, for example, or how social media platforms operate, or how young people use social media platforms. So that kind of disconnect in language and in culture creates kind of difficulties in really being able to reach young people with that message. So I think programming like video games that are meant to be educational, but they're also aesthetically pretty, that they're interesting, that they're fun to play and walk through. I think that does a lot in terms of recognizing a cultural need and really creating a bridge between kind of like the anti-hate, anti-fascist space and younger people who I think would be very receptive to that message if it was spoken to them in a way that they understand and appreciate. So I think that solutions like this really work out well.
Thanks. So I mentioned before Luc Bernard, I made an interview with him previously. He's also a Holocaust game creator. He's the creator of The Light in the Darkness. It should be released this year. And he said that his game won't be released on Steam pages and forums because they are, quote, full of Nazi-like far-right commentary. And my question is that, I actually have multiple questions. Do you think that the gaming community is a community which is particularly vulnerable for the influence of far-right rhetoric, and these communities' platforms are a platform for youth radicalization passively? What can we do to fight this kind of radicalization and the far-right rhetoric on these platforms? And what were your experiences on these platforms, if you use them? I don't know if you have actually researched them closely, or you were rather focusing on other social media platforms.
We do view the gaming community. This is a very multi-part question, so I would have to compartmentalize my thoughts here. But from the start about like Steam being vulnerable, we do view the gaming community as a whole as vulnerable to the influence of the far right. Part of this that we haven't touched on today is that video game communities have long found their homes online, where the far right has effectively been mobilizing for a very long time. So forums, guides, and of course, online games themselves rely on online communities more than in-person ones. Another part of this is that practically from the beginning, video games have been made and marketed to an assumed market of young men. This may be hard to take in for modern gamers because so many of the hits we remember over the years don't seem like this is the case. But even Pac-Man, a game that is very universally beloved across demographics, actually began development as a game made for women or for girls to balance video games made for boys that were more like asteroids at the time. So this norm has stayed with video games until today. So when the modern men's rights movement formed a cultural identity during the birth of the alt-right, which is a lot of what we see the modern hate activism today stemmed from, video games were a logical choice for them to rally around. Young male gamers were given a narrative, an idea that women were taking away an identity that was theirs, and it worked. Misogyny was at the root of a lot of what they believed in, and it acted as a catalyst for other types of hate. The far right needed this, and they effectively used it very well. Next part of the question was, what can be done against it? I think Étienne might have something better to say about that than me.
Well, sorry.
Yeah,
no, it is a big question. I think like when it comes to video games, especially online video games, there's functions, and I'm jumping off of a lot of what my colleagues said. But when it comes to some of the harassment that you see on platforms like Steam, and on video game lobbies, whether you're playing Call of Duty or any of those games that have like a lobby where you can speak to other people, there's a bullying aspect that really comes back to really wanting to keep that space exclusive, typically for young men, and typically in particular for young white boys. I think it's really important to know that hate movements tend to target subcultural spaces in order to grow their ranks, right? That's true for a number of different communities. We've seen it with different music communities over the years. We've seen it with special interest communities. We've seen it for wellness. We've seen it for yoga. But it's especially true for gaming, especially because of the factors, of the identity factors that my colleague mentioned. But gaming spaces tend to be majority male. But it goes beyond that, I think. I think hate movements and hate promoting individuals have been to target not just gaming spaces, but also the spaces that surround them. They understand, for example, that they kind of understand the rituals that gamers have. For example, gamers tend to listen to music or stream videos in the background when they play. And lo and behold, many of the most popular, if not the most popular hate peddlers today in the world use streaming platforms, Twitch, DLive, and so on, platforms that are associated to gaming, or they make music videos so that they can get in the ears of gamers at a time where, they're focused on entertainment and less on critical thought. So people will be playing these video games and listening to this information, not necessarily realizing that the information is political, but just internalizing it in a way that they're completely disarmed to the message and to its intent. And I think the overlap between gaming communities and hate movements is really kind of speaks to the demographics which form the latter. Video games are really played by young people, either from Generation Z or millennials. And we know that hate movements have long sought to target young people for radicalization because young people bring a certain amount of energy to their movements. But I think they've been increasingly successful at reaching a public that's increasingly young. And we know there's tons of evidence for that. There's some more anecdotal evidence that I could mention because I've talked to teachers who've brought up issues that have happened in their classrooms and workshop. But we also have hard data in the Canadian context, which shows us that young people are disproportionately represented in hate crime statistics. So it's all a cause for concern. And I think when it comes to solution, once again, there really is a need for culturally appropriate solutions that reach young people in the spaces that they inhabit, in real life, but also virtually. And especially even in the entertainment sphere, like I do think there's a gap there that needs to be filled in terms of making sure that instead of listening to a racist hate speaker on Twitch for a few hours while they're playing video games, they'll listen to something a little more healthy or a little more appropriate, or from the get-go that they're playing a video game that is both interesting, fun to play, but also really informative and promotes accurate information.
Yeah, no, to address the Steam part specifically of Steam being kind of a vector for hate speech, it's I don't hesitate to paint it with a broad brush, but I do see we do see that is a problem with it. And with Steam specifically, it's a very difficult topic to address because until relatively recently in PC gaming history, Steam was too big to fail. It was too big to use an alternative for. So the only solutions to counter that were on Steam. It's only kind of in the recently, rounding up to a better part of a decade, that alternatives like GOG and Epic Games have launched their own streaming services to compete with Steam. So people actually have somewhat of a say in maybe it might feel like gamers actually have a little bit more of an influence of the community that happens there. So it's difficult to keep up with this, but I think it'll remain to be seen in the next maybe 5 to 10 years because these things do happen really slowly when it comes to things as big as Steam, if that adapts to the way that the water's flowing, so to speak.
And to go back to the piece as to whether or not we looked at specific platforms, our methodology really had us looking throughout major social media platforms. So that's usually like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the likes. But we also we didn't look specifically at Steam, but we looked at platforms that are typically associated to gaming, whether that's Discord. We looked at scraped files from Discord chats. We also looked at 4chan, Reddit, and even YouTube in some cases. So we didn't look at Steam specifically because it's a bit hard to research and get a lot of data from that, because you would have to individually research accounts rather than pull up a whole list of accounts or posts. But what we found in our research really, confirms the fact that gaming adjacent spaces are not only just used by hate movements, but that a lot of their propaganda, a lot of their memes even discuss or reference video games. So we see really that video games, whether that's the spaces that surround them, the games themselves, they're really important to them. Like they play a very, very big function in how especially novel movements operate. And that's something that we really need to focus on.
Thank you. My next question is a shorter one. So you have created lesson plans and educational resources designed to help mediate between hateful content and conduct and the students' online experiences. I'm curious to learn more about these resources and what was the reception of these lesson plans in the classroom.
Étienne will speak more to the can speak more to the specifics, or I shouldn't speak on his behalf, but I think he can speak more to the specifics. But while our lesson plans are still being developed, we find that while we're developing them, something that we find it really helps is to listen to feedback from teachers and students as we go to actually hear what they want. So that way we can incorporate the lessons specifically geared for what they're concerned about. Our first sort of evergreen presentation evergreen, meaning repeatedly give it, going into classrooms, was TikTok and the Holocaust. And it was a lesson plan about how the Holocaust was discussed and taught by content creators on TikTok, whether accurately or whether it was taught misinformed. This included hate propaganda and videos made for youth that try to normalize Holocaust denial as part of a radicalization process. But it also contained possible misinformation that was made for other reasons, well-meaning reasons. And we did TikTok specifically, actually at the request of the Neuberger Holocaust Education Center, specifically because parents and teachers were asking the Holocaust Education Center about TikTok. They had fears and anxieties about navigating TikTok, about their students navigating TikTok. Likewise, Etienne's been getting teachers asking him with valid concerns about hate speech in video games like Roblox and other toxic environments that might seep into Roblox, as he mentioned earlier, with the subcultural influence.
Yeah, I'd say, like, again, really stressing the piece of listening to feedback from teachers. Like that's really kind of, I think a big part of our work really is to realize that there is, again, a gap in language between teachers and students, between parents and students, where they're not necessarily up to date on the latest cultural trends, on the latest social media platforms, on the latest video games. And that language gap makes it really difficult for them to have proper dialogue with their students about what's going on in the classroom, but even outside of the classroom. So we're really listening to their feedback, seeing what's needed. But what we're realizing is that we're really starting from, in a lot of cases, from point zero, where we have to really create almost like a fulsome understanding of that culture, of what cultural spaces are like in 2023. Without necessarily making it inaccessible for either of the parties involved to be, to understand what's being said or to understand what's being conveyed. So we're really working to bridge that gap. And that's really what these programs are for. We've run a lot of workshops, and what we're now doing is we're translating a lot of the workshops that we've done into materials that can continue to be used in classrooms, either for small lessons or even videos that will be presented in classrooms moving forward. So it's really the objective of our project is to bridge the gap between students and parents and teachers and people who can help them in situations where they're either facing online hate or even this potentially falling into the wrong communities online as well.
And my last question is actually that I would like to know if you have personally any video game you would recommend, for example, for students in a classroom, a video game which can help them understand collective memory of certain events or help them maybe address hate, online hate.
Although I'm really excited for gamification in the classrooms and being part of the generation that got to see games get tested out in classrooms, I think it's very exciting to watch that emergence. I struggle to personally recommend anything as a gaming experience specifically. I'm personally a big fan of the Wolfenstein video games and how the Metro 2033 series touches on Nazism and the Holocaust, although neither delve deep into it in a way that I think is historically perfect for a lesson. And I also I hesitate to recommend either, as neither are accessible to people who aren't used to playing first-person adventure games and shooting games. So I'm excited for Light in the Darkness, most especially because it seems like it will not just address the setting in a very meaningful way, not just as an atmosphere, but as the main theme, but because it'll focus on storytelling over action. And this seems like it'll make it a much more accessible choice to recommend. Additionally, it seems like a lot of these games require hardware that isn't necessarily accessible to everyone. A top-end gaming computer can be obviously not the most accessible thing to everyone. Neither is a next-generation video game console. So a low price tag for something like free and something that runs on maybe school laptops would have to be the first step for me to strongly recommend it.
And yeah, likewise, I think games like A Light in the Darkness, which is set to be released in a few months, they're a good fit for a classroom, and even for indie gamers who are kind of interested in a game experience that's not just kind of exhilarating and almost overpowering, but a gaming experience that's meaningful and kind of interesting in a way that's more knowledge oriented than entertainment oriented. But I also don't necessarily think that fighting hate in the context of video games is just a classroom thing. I think when it comes to gaming culture and anti-racism in general, I think those are things that shouldn't just be reactive, right? We shouldn't just teach children about fighting hate or about anti-fascism or about anti-racism in the context of rising hate. We should be teaching children and teenagers about fighting hate as a thing that we should all be doing. And I think one of the things that, for example, hate movements have done quite well, unfortunately, is to take gaming, video games that aren't necessarily racist or hateful, things like Minecraft and Roblox, for example, as kind of a playground for kind of living their fascist fantasies and creating societies. We are playing on a Minecraft server and you're building kind of a fascist society and living by those rules. And I think that the opposite should be done as well, that like we should encourage children to be anti-racist, obviously in the classroom, but also in their video games experiences outside of the classroom. I think that the values that they should be taught, they should display as well outside. And so, why don't we encourage children to kind of envision how they can use video games that currently exist in order to kind of promote an anti-fascist set of values. So I think that's really important in terms of kind of video game recommendations. When it comes to specific games, I do think that a lot of them might not be suited for the classroom. We've talked about a lot of, especially when it comes to collective memory, I think a lot of those games tend to be a little bit more violent, a little bit more graphic, and that's not necessarily appropriate for the classroom. But I do think that there's a lot of room to use, even games that currently exist, like even in the classroom, to use games like Minecraft to even kind of be able to create those like anti-racist utopias that we think of, and like really have some fun and have some, be able to create kind of a creativity aspect to being anti-racist as part of a curriculum inside the classroom.
Yeah, make short little skits and make skits on in Minecraft that have positive messages and show them, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I just the world is your oyster at the end of the day, and I do think that we can't just be reactive when it comes to hate. Like, we have to be anti-hate even when hate isn't there in front of us, because that's how we build a society that's better for everyone in the long run.
Thank you very much.